Thank you very much. My name's Dan Martin. I'm from the Royal Free Hospital and University College London. And I'm going to talk to you today in my role as the critical care lead for the high-level isolation unit at the Royal Free Hospital, which admits patients with viral hemorrhagic fevers, including Ebola virus disease. So I think it's fair to say that the human race has been ravaged by epidemics and pandemics throughout its history. The plague over the last 2,000 years or so, on and off, has led to somewhere between 50 and 150 million deaths. More recently, the Spanish flu epidemic, which started in 1918, led to about 50 million deaths. And finally, the cowpox epidemic led to somewhere between 300 and 500 million deaths. And this is only 3 diseases. Ebola virus disease was the first outbreaks were simultaneously seen in Sudan and former Zaire. It was first identified in 1976 by this gentleman here, Peter Piot. He's a young microbiologist who is working in Belgium. He's now the director of the School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine just down the road from here. But he was in his laboratory when he received some samples of blood from Zaire, which were taken from a nun who was infected with a mystery illness. And there were many people dying of this mystery illness. The samples were actually brought across just in some glass vials in someone's hand luggage in a commercial flight and delivered to him in his laboratory. And he spent a week or so examining these under a microscope and electron microscopes, and discovered a new virus, and was so interested in this virus and the entire disease process that within 2 weeks he and his team were on an airplane to Kinshasa in West Africa. And they went there, they studied the disease, they looked at the epidemiology, and they saw the whole outbreak through to the very end, where over 400 people unfortunately died. And at the end of that process, they named this disease Ebola, after a river that flowed nearby to the village where it was first discovered. Ebola has symptoms which are common with other viral hemorrhagic fevers. In its early stages, very non-specific symptoms. So you get a fever, a rash, joint pains, and fatigue. The next phase, you get substantial diarrhea and vomiting, and this is what most people unfortunately die from in West Africa. And in the pre-terminal phases of Ebola, you get uncontrollable bleeding from all areas of the body. It's a highly contagious disease, and it's spread by direct contact. The virus is usually passed on from human to human in infected bodily fluids, which are touched between person to person. So just to remind you of the magnitude of the most recent outbreak of Ebola virus disease from 2014 to 2016, over 28,000 people were infected with Ebola. There were over 11,000 deaths as a result of this disease. And perhaps pertinent to us, over 500 healthcare workers died who were there helping people with this disease. So how did Ebola end up in the middle of central London? Well, in the modern era that we live in, air travel is very, very simple and very rapid. You can see a map on the right-hand corner there of all the commercial flights available today. So what it means is that anybody who is infected unknowingly with a disease like Ebola can very easily get on an aeroplane and within 12 to 24 hours can be literally anywhere in the world before they've even developed any symptoms. And these countries here on the left all treated patients with Ebola virus disease, so the USA and numerous countries across Europe. And I think in the future this is going to be an enormous part of the process of the spread of epidemics and pandemics around the world. But the second factor that we have to consider about how Ebola virus disease managed to be in London is the fact that we repatriated people from West Africa who were diagnosed with the disease. These are the 3 patients that were treated in the United Kingdom. All 3 of them were nurses who were out there treating West Africans with the disease. 2 of them are NHS nurses and 1 is a British Army nurse. One was diagnosed in the UK with the disease, and 2 were diagnosed in Sierra Leone and then repatriated by the Royal Air Force back to the United Kingdom. This caused a lot of difficulty at the time, and there were a lot of discussions in Whitehall that we were involved in because it's reasonably obvious that bringing people back to the United Kingdom with a deadly, highly contagious disease is not without potential complications. Not only that, there was a lot of discussion throughout the medical community and again with Whitehall about whether or not these patients should be offered critical care and organ support if they reach that stage of their disease due to the very high mortality this disease carries. It's worth saying that this is not the first time we've seen Ebola virus disease in the United Kingdom. The first patient ever to be treated with it was in 1976, the year that it was first discovered. Unfortunately, a laboratory worker working in the Porton Down microbiological research establishment who was handling blood samples from infected people in West Africa got a needle stick injury and tested positive for Ebola. He was brought to an isolation unit at Coppets Wood Hospital in North London, the former location of the unit that we currently have at the Royal Free now. He was isolated in basically the same style of unit that we have at the Royal Free Hospital, treated with interferon and convalescent plasma and made a full recovery. And I think the important thing to take home from his recovery is also that no members of staff were actually infected with this disease during the care of the patient. So those 3 patients that I showed you were all treated at the Royal Free Hospital in Hampstead, where there is a high-level isolation unit that's on call 24 hours a day, every day of the year, to take into the unit any patient in the UK with viral hemorrhagic fever. And we have over 40 years of experience at treating people with viral hemorrhagic fevers now. The unit is fairly large. This is a floor plan of the unit, and this is an aerial photograph of the hospital. The unit is completely secure and takes up the space that a normal hospital ward would take up, so where you would normally have 30 or so patients. Within the unit we have 2 isolation areas, so we can hold 2 patients at any one time. And all of the rest of the unit is simply the infrastructure that's required to literally create a hospital within a hospital. So we can function completely independently to the rest of the hospital whilst we're up and running. We have our own laboratories, our own decontamination units, our own waste disposal. The colour on the diagram that you see is sort of colour coding for clean, semi-clean and dirty areas. One-way doors lock behind you as you move from one area of the unit to the other to prevent you from infecting people on the other side. And too small to see, the whole unit is under negative pressure, with all the air in the unit being sort of sucked towards the isolation units themselves and then out of the building through a decontamination unit. So this is the isolator that we manage patients in when they come into the unit. We have 2 of these Trexler plastic isolators, a sort of flexible plastic with 5 half suits built into the wall of the isolator. So 2 either side and then 1 for the anaesthetist at the head end of the isolator. And as you can imagine, it's reasonably challenging to look after patients in this environment, but the reason that we use it is because it's much safer to treat people in this way than the perhaps more common PPE or personal protective equipment that you may have seen on the news around the time of the Ebola outbreak, the sort of suits and masks and goggles that people wear for that purpose. This is what it looks like when you get inside one of the half suits. This is one of our senior nurses inside it. And you can see it's quite an unusual sort of affair. You sort of crouch down, get up inside the suit, and once you are in the suit, you are literally inside the isolation area with the patient. And it's quite a strange feeling when you first get into the suit. You're literally hovering above the patient and sharing this unusual world which they're confined to for many weeks during their illness. I'm not going to go into the details of how we treat these patients, but broadly we can break it up into two very important components. The first of those is safe supportive therapy, and that includes critical care and organ support. And I cannot stress enough really the importance of our nursing staff in delivering this care. We usually have 2 nurses inside the isolator room 24 hours a day, and according to the severity of the illness of the patient, we may increase that to 3 or to even 4 nurses, so that with a ratio then finally of 4 nurses to 1 patient. So it's a large drain on resources, but we think that this is the only way that we can manage these patients effectively. The other component is the experimental medicines which we have access to. During the time that these 3 patients were with us at the Royal Free, we had access to literally every compound in the world which was thought to have an effectiveness against Ebola virus disease. And we used many compounds, I call them compounds rather than drugs, because they were simply molecules that were being developed and had never before been given to a human being. So there's an enormous amount of ethical dilemma, again, in trying to decide whether or not we should give these compounds to people when we're unsure of their effectiveness or their side effect profile. The teamwork of working in this sort of environment is very important indeed. We have a very tight team of people who work within that hospital, within a hospital, 24 hours a day, in intensive care doctors, infectious diseases doctors, the nurses, the physiotherapists, and pharmacists, all working very closely together to deliver excellent care to these patients. The sort of broad structure of how we delivered that care was that every 12 hours we would have a multidisciplinary team meeting, and these were really superb meetings. We all often think that we work in an environment where it's a multidisciplinary team, but this was truly a large team of people working together to achieve a goal, and it was a phenomenal thing to see. At these 12-hourly meetings, we had to have a very detailed situation analysis of the 1 patient that we were looking after. And then the important component of it was that every single person in the room had a voice, everyone's opinion was considered. And then right at the end of that, we would have this sort of debate and commit policy where we would choose 1 single management pathway, and that's what we would stick with until 12 hours later we would have the next meeting. And this was this sort of became a very effective way of managing these patients. So outside of this very tight-knit group of people, sort of hidden away within the secure unit, there was another much broader team of people helping us to deliver that care, the logistics of what happens to provide care for these patients. This broader group of people met every 24 hours and included operations managers, the executive board of the hospital, the communications team for the hospital, porters, the estates, the facilities people. They had to make sure that the unit kept running without any malfunctions 24 hours a day, and they really did a phenomenal job. And it should also be remembered that outside of that team was the rest of the hospital. We had to deliver the treatment for these patients without affecting normal business for NHS patients. This was very challenging in the hospital. It was all over the news, so people know they're coming to a hospital where patients with Ebola are being treated. And there's a group of us who cannot really engage with our normal practice in the hospital, so everyone else in the hospital had to sort of fill in the gaps and continue to deliver care for the rest of the patients in the hospital without affecting that. And I think it's worth just mentioning 1 patient in particular who you've probably read about in the news quite a lot. This is Pauline Key, who we all became very fond of and familiar with. Pauline spent a very long time with us in the unit when she was first unwell. She was extremely unwell and very lucky to survive. And it was very distressing to us that 8 months after she had been discharged from the hospital, she was readmitted to the hospital with reactivation of her Ebola virus, a very unusual situation indeed. And the virus had attacked her central nervous system and she basically had meningitis. And it was really quite an emotional scene to see her have to go back into the isolation unit that she spent so long in 8 months ago, and remarkable that she managed to recover from that. So I think it was a credit to the NHS that not only was this possible, but it was also successful, and I was very proud to be a part of the team that delivered that. And I think the last thing I'd like to say is that I was honoured and very humbled to receive an OBE for my part in this sort of chapter of the NHS's history. And I think on this celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Royal College of Anaesthetists, I hope that the honour that was bestowed upon me is really an inspiration for anaesthetists of the future, and I hope it highlights to them the importance of anaesthesia in modern day medicine. Thank you very much.